Dragon Warrior was a localized version of Dragon Quest, which was a huge RPG franchise in Japan.
So Dragon Warrior was incredibly important in Japan when it was first created for the Famicom in 1986.
Yuji Horii, the creator, was inspired by Western RPGs, and his goal was to really just popularize the genre and video games in general.
The game is fantastic. It's the definition of a press A to win game. Literally, you cannot lose this game if you just level up to the proper level before you take on a task.
The console foundation of many tropes we find in role-playing games today. You have your experience points, you have your magic spells, you have your attack and defense points, and you can equip items and weapons and armor. I mean, really classic basic stuff.
So Nintendo thought, we're gonna bring it over to the US. The problem is that no one cared, no one bought it the first year it came out.
They overestimated America's burgeoning love for Old English dialogue text and having to choose stairs to go upstairs.
The problem is that this was a game developed first in 1986. This is 1989, and it's aged a bit.
What Nintendo did a year later in '90 was offer an insane deal. If you bought or re-upped your Nintendo Power subscription, they sent you a free copy of Dragon Warrior.
If you buy a one-year subscription, $20 subscription to our gaming magazine, Nintendo Power, you will get for free a $50 NES game.
But Nintendo didn't trust that kids would know what they were doing. So besides pumping the hell out of Dragon Warrior in issues of Nintendo Power, they don't not only send you the game, they send you a huge handbook that was literally a walkthrough of the entire game.
And a reference card for what level you should be at.
Posters and maps.
Posters and maps of all the enemies in the game. Spoiler alert, here's every enemy in the game, its hit points and what you need to do to beat it.
It is the granddaddy of console RPGs and should be respected. Dang it.
Minesweeper and Solitaire.
Done. We're talking about Minesweeper and Solitaire?
I mean, you always play games on your computer, but these were games built into the OS.
Yeah.
Solitaire is exactly what it says it is. It is a game of solitaire cards.
Wes Cherry was the developer of this game, but he received no royalties.
Minesweeper is a little puzzle logic game where you have to clear the land of all the free blocks and put flags on all the spots that are mines before you can move on.
It was the beginning of a throwback to what games used to be, which were just quick time wasters, but done in a much more convenient form, you know, at work on your computer.
And I like the multiplayer online feature of Solitaire, kicked ass.
Oh, totally.
It's when productivity started to evaporate in the office.
You don't want to write up that term paper? Back in 1989, I'll play a little bit of Minesweeper past the time. I'll play some Solitaire.
Screw it, I want to make those cards bounce again.
Yeah.
What is this? Talking about the 90s? Was that in the 90s?
Sega introduces America's Most Wanted. Wonder Boy 3, wanted for killing monsters and demons in his quest to lift the dragon's curse. Wanted for its constantly changing adventure experience. California Games, wanted for its fun in the sun and surf. Wanted because up to 8 friends can compete in great outdoor summer sports. Wonder Boy 3, California Games, America's Most Wanted. From Sega.
Bomberman by Hudson Soft for the NES.
Bomberman was released in North America in 1989, despite it being released on the MSX in 1983 and the Famicom in 1985.
Graphics are a little bit dated, but that's okay because the core gameplay is still there, it's still good.
It's an overhead maze style game, and any of the brick-shaped, looking tiles can be blown up by bombs.
There are power-ups that increase your firepower's range and allow you to drop more bombs and make bombing faster.
And really, the entire goal is to escape basically from a dungeon by finding the staircase in every level and working your way up through, I believe, what is 100 levels.
Bombs can blow up walls, enemies, you can set off chain reactions of bombs, and you can, of course, and you often do, blow up yourself.
Not a great game, the original Bomberman. It lacked a little bit, didn't didn't really have, multiplayer.
It wasn't necessarily a huge hit in the States, and probably not like the #1 game to get in 1989 on the NES, but it was huge in Japan, and it was just one of those series that never ended. They just kept putting them out.
Late in the 20th century, terminal boredom fell upon the land. The maker looked down and said, "This is not good." And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the challenge, twice the fun, with high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad." Discover Genesis.
The Sega Genesis, aka the Mega Drive outside the US, was the successor to the Sega Master System.
It launched in August of 1989 in the United States, and it would eventually take the country by storm.
Sega Genesis is the first home console to take a really good shot at emulating the arcade experience at home.
Sega had these games lined up, ready to go. And go they went.
The Genesis is actually a dumbed-down version of Sega's arcade hardware, the System 16, which is why a lot of those games looked pretty authentic.
The first year or so of this system was based almost solely on the Sega ports of the arcade games and really nice sports titles.
And just in case you forgot that it's 16 bits, it says right on the top.
I mean, it felt like a more adult video game system. It looked different. It looked like something you can put on your AV rack with your stereo.
And it's high-definition graphics.
The Sega Genesis became super popular because it was advertised as the cool system that had sports games, had arcade games, and it had Sonic the Hedgehog eventually.
This wasn't a kiddie system. This was like, all right, you had an NES for like 3-4 years. This is the next step.
Because we were getting older, it's like, oh, I'm getting older. This is my kind of system.
They were going directly in an edgier sort of direction.
Genesis threw down the gauntlet right out of the gate with Nintendo, challenging them with slogans like, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't."
The original 3-button controllers weren't the greatest in the world. They were kind of too big.
Yeah, pretty big.
The giant controller in my tiny boy hands, it just felt so huge.
Right.
So the Sega Genesis offered 512 colors with up to 61 of them available on screen at a single time.
And it had a great sound chip.
The sound on the Genesis is FM synthesis, which is not something that you normally see on a console.
Basically, the sound chip was only as good as the developer.
A lot of those developers were able to really push that system and the sound capabilities that it had.
It launched with some fairly good games. It was packed in with Altered Beast, which was a fairly good translation of the arcade game.
As you got power-ups, you'd get one shot of steroids, you get a little bit bigger.
I love it when you get 2 of the power-ups and you're this big old buff dude with this tiny little head.
What it did manage to do was show off big sprites, lots of colors, vocal samples.
Rise from your grave.
Nintendo had such an iron fist policy with their third-party developers that people were scared to go to the Genesis.
It was the first true competitor to the NES, and Sega was the first company to knock Nintendo down a peg or two.
It was the system that would eventually make Nintendo rethink their illegal licensing practices.
Really, from the get-go, it was really hard for Sega to grab any footing, but they did it.
This was just the start of the rivalry between Genesis and eventually the Super Nintendo with their Genesis, with their blast processing and whatnot.
This is Sega getting their foot in the door in '89. It would not be a huge system yet. Give it a year or two, it's going to come a knocking.